over the past 300 years by author Orlando ๊faɪdʒiːz. Beginning with the building of St. Petersburg, ๊faɪdʒiːz interweaves great works with cultural and artistic events through the challenges of the Soviet and post-Soviet regimes. The program runs about an hour.
Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of Kennan Institute Director Blair Rubel, I welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Joseph Dresden, and I am a program associate with the Kennan Institute. Before we begin, I'd like to announce some upcoming events for next week. On Monday, November 4th, Vladimir Dubovic, a visiting scholar at the University of Maryland, College Park, and a former Kennan Institute Regional Exchange Scholar, will give a presentation on U.S.-Ukraine relations in the new security environment. Later that week, on November 7th, it's a Thursday, James Duran, Professor Emeritus, Department of History of Canisius College, will speak on Putin's economic straitjacket, austere budgeting in a poor state. Today we are privileged to host a book launch for Natasha's Dance, A Cultural History of Russia, written by Orlando ๊faɪdʒiːz, Professor of History at Birkbeck College of London University. Here is a copy of the book, and there are copies for sale outside. Professor ๊faɪdʒiːz has agreed to sign books purchased here after this session. Professor ๊faɪdʒiːz is one of the foremost authorities on Russian history, and his book on the Russian Revolution, A People's Tragedy, is the recipient of the Wolfson Prize for History and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, among others. His newest book, Natasha's Dance, has been met with early widespread acclaim from the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books, Publishers Weekly, Kirkus Reviews, only to name a few. It is a sweeping panorama of Russian culture and history from the founding of St. Petersburg, Russia's window to the West, to the Brezhnev era and composer Igor Stravinsky's emotional return to his homeland from 50 years of exile. It is also a search to understand Russianness through pulling on strings of history, poetry, folklore, customs and rituals, landscape, music, and of course a certain famous dance from Russian literature. We are pleased to have Professor ๊faɪdʒiːz with us here today, and we look forward to hearing his thoughts on his ambitious new work.
Joseph, thank you very much. I take it I'm audible. Can you see that picture at the back? No.
We
could
we're dimming the lights right now.
Dim the lights. Ah, that's great. Thank you very much. Yes. Well, thank you for that, Joseph. It's a pleasure to be here. And as you say, the book is made up of a lot of different components, trying to get at something quite subtle and elusive indeed, namely a sensibility which one could place at the heart of something we would call culture, whatever that is, and I would like to try and unpack both those concepts a bit today. Having finished the book and not really knowing how to frame it, my editor in America said, well, why don't you focus on something rather beautiful? And since the book had always really been about trying to engage with the beauty that I've always found in Russia, I decided to go to the Natasha dancing scene because it was always a scene I'd loved, and Natasha was always someone I'd been in love with. And in fact, as I began to think about it more and more, it was a very useful way to introduce some of the themes of the book and also some of the questions about how one can write a cultural history at all. No doubt the scene is known to all of you here, I'm sure, but let me just recap very briefly on it. It's that moment in War and Peace when Natasha Rostov and her brother Nikolai find themselves at the end of a day's hunting in the woods being invited back to their uncle's cabin. It's not really clear whether he is an uncle of the Rostov family. Uncle appears in inverted commas. But he lives there, retired army captain from civil service, with a woman called Anicia, who's introduced as his housekeeper, but it becomes clear from the looks between them that she's also some sort of unofficial wife. And she brings in a tray laden with lots of Russian goodies, cherry brandy, vodka of various flavours, and then Natasha hears the strains of a balalaika being played from a back room where the hunting serfs are, and Uncle realises she's curious and calls for his his guitar to be brought out, and he begins to play a popular melody, Came a Maiden Down the Street, and calls on Natasha to dance. And let me just read briefly from that scene. "Now then, niece," he exclaimed, waving to Natasha the hand that had just struck a chord. Natasha threw off the shawl from her shoulders, ran forward to face Uncle, and setting her arms akimbo, also made a motion with her shoulders and struck an attitude. Where, how and when had this young countess, educated by an émigré French governess, imbibed from the Russian air she breathed that spirit and obtained that manner which the pas de châle would, one would have supposed, long ago have effaced? But the spirit and the movements were those inimitable and unteachable Russian ones that Uncle had expected of her. As soon as she had struck her pose and smiled triumphantly, proudly, and with sly merriment, she had the fear that had first seized Nikolai and the others that she might not do the right thing was at an end, and they were all already admiring her. She did the right thing with such precision, such complete precision, that Anisya Fyodorovna, who had at once handed her the handkerchief she needed for the dance, had tears in her eyes, though she laughed as she watched this slim, graceful countess, reared in silks and velvets, and so different from herself, who yet was able to understand all that was in Anisya, and in Anisya's father and mother and aunt, and in every Russian man and woman. So we could ask what enabled Natasha to pick up so instinctively the rhythms of the dance. How could she step so easily into this village culture from which, by education and social class, she was so obviously far removed? Are we to suppose, as Tolstoy does in this romantic and, one might add, highly unlikely scene, that a nation such as Russia may be held together by the unseen threads of a native sensibility? This, then, is the question that I've tried to tackle. And the subject of the book is not just, as a cultural history, great creative works of art, like War and Peace, but cultural artifacts, from the folk embroidery of Natasha's shawl to the musical conventions of the peasant dance. And it's folklore and religion and social customs and beliefs as well. What I wanted to do was to explore the way that music, art and literature, all the great art forms, became entangled with custom and social belief in the apprehension and artistic articulation of what we call national identity. I wanted to explain, moreover, how these artistic myths of Russia became powerful political ideas that organized society. Russian culture, it seems to me, needs historians to make these broad, multidisciplinary links. If you think about it, nowhere else have the arts been quite so entangled in social movements and ideas. Because, basically, for the past 200 years or so, the arts in Russia have served as a main arena for political, philosophical and religious debate in the absence of a parliament or a free press or even a free church. As Tolstoy explained in A Few Words About War and Peace, the great artistic prose works of the 19th century were not meant as novels in the European sense. They were huge poetic structures for symbolic contemplation, not unlike an icon, laboratories in which to test ideas, and like science or religion, they were animated by the search for truth. But the overarching theme of all these works, or the great majority of them, it seems to me, was the theme of Russia itself, its history and destiny, its spiritual essence, its place in the world, in a way that was extraordinary, if not unique to Russia. The country's artistic energy was almost wholly given to the quest to grasp the idea of its nationality. Nowhere has the artist been quite so burdened with the task of national leadership, and for that very reason, nowhere has the artist been more feared and persecuted by the state. Alienated from official Russia by their politics, from peasant Russia by their education, Russia's artists from roughly the 1820s and 30s onwards took it on themselves to create a national community through values and ideas of literature and art. And at the center of many of their works is the question of what it means to be a Russian. Where was the true Russia? In Europe or in Asia? In Petersburg or in Moscow? In the palaces of the Tsars or in the muddy one-street village where Natasha's uncle lived? These, then, were the questions that preoccupied not just every serious writer, poet, musician, artist, but many folklorists and indeed many geologists and archaeologists in that golden age of Russian culture, from the age of Pushkin to the age of Pasternak. And what I've tried to do is to take all of these manifestations together, make links between them, to try to come up with a history of ideas and attitudes, using works of art not as a window onto life, but as a record of belief, or notions of the nation by which Russia came to understand itself. Because I think if we look carefully at these, we can use them as a window on a nation's inner life. Now, Natasha's dancing scene is one such opening. At its heart is the encounter that runs right through Natasha's Dance, the book that I've written, the encounter between two entirely different worlds. The European culture of the upper classes and the native or Russian culture of the peasantry. From the beginning of the 18th century, the aristocracy, especially in St. Petersburg, less so, but still in the provinces too, had immersed itself in the culture of the West. It built European palaces, it bought imported clothes and furniture, it adopted foreign manners and conventions, secular ideas and attitudes, it read foreign books, it imitated Western works of art, and it spoke in French and English better on the whole than it spoke its native tongue. A question, I think, a terribly important question about language, which we might return to when we come to open discussion. This, then, was the cosmopolitan culture of Tolstoy's own childhood, which he placed at the center of War and Peace. As I say, then, this creative tension between the high and low culture of Russia is, I think, the driving force of so much of that Russian cultural renaissance of the 19th and early 20th centuries. There was an obsessive quest by artists like Tolstoy to capture, apprehend, encapsulate, express the unique features of this native culture, and to find the common threads, whether that be in language, in custom, in religious belief, or in what Herzen called the feudal bonds of affection uniting the nobleman with the serf domestics, that might bind Russia's elites with the Russian people. The War of 1812 was the first moment when these two cultures, Russia's high and low culture, in a sense began to move together in a national formation. And that's, I suppose, why Tolstoy focused War and Peace as a sort of national epic at that time. Stirred by the patriotic spirit of their serfs, the aristocracy of Natasha's generation began to break free from the foreign conventions of their society and search for a new nation based on Russian principles. Now, clearly, that was something going on throughout Europe. They were influenced terribly by the Romantic writers of Germany in this endeavour. But there was a particular political dimension to that quest for Russianness, which so obviously stemmed from the great social divide in Russia at the time. And it added a particular flavour to the Russian national moment. We can see this return to native ways in this print by Adolphe Laduria, which is, as you all no doubt know, in the Winter Palace, view of the White Hall in the Winter Palace, dated 1838. And you can see, dimly, albeit, on the left, Russian society ladies coming to a ball wearing a sarafan, a traditional Russian headdress. We also know from records that about this time, the pliaska, the Russian or Polish dance, began to appear at society balls, even in the Winter Palace, alongside the traditional, French mazurkas, waltzes such as Natasha herself danced in War and Peace. And indeed, like Natasha, there were many noble women who had learned to dance the pliaska and other Russian dances by this link, as Herzen put it, with the serfs who had brought them up. And there were in society women who made quite a name for themselves in the 1830s and 40s, dancing in a very virtuoso manner the traditional Russian dance at society balls. We can see it too in fashion. As in this portrait by Vasily Tropinin of Pushkin, dated 1827, where the great poet is pictured in a khalat, in the traditional Russian, it's such a splendid institution, isn't it? The khalat, the house coat, which is also formal enough to receive guests. So here we have the portrait of a thoroughly Europeanized Russian gentleman who's perfectly at ease with the customs of his native land. At the same time, as Tolstoy reminds us throughout War and Peace, Russians were switching in society, in the salons and the ballrooms, in their own boudoirs and reception rooms. They were switching from speaking French to speaking Russian. And it was a long, protracted process. It didn't happen quite as quickly as Tolstoy, with great artistic license, suggests immediately after 1812. And it was obviously going to be a very difficult transition because so many Russian words for individual expression. I mean, basically, Russian salon language was incredibly Gallicized, with most words adapted or neologisms from the French. You might recall that scene in War and Peace where at Princess Helene's salon, where they decide that there'll be a forfeit paid for everybody who speaks in a French word. But since they can't remember or think of a Russian word for forfeit, they say that there'd have to be a forfaiture. And we see from about this time that Russian grammar begins to enter into the curriculum of many Petersburg noble children from about the 1810s and 20s. The Russians began to make a thing of eating Russian foods as well. And we see the first Russian cookbook published only as late as the 1810s. And we see changes in interior design. My own favourite example is that of Count Osterman Tolstoy, who has his famous palace on the English embankment in St. Petersburg, and the grand reception rooms are, as you might expect them, in the sort of classical Rococo style, with lots of marble and floor-to-ceiling mirrors. But in the private, more intimate setting of the bedroom, he uses Karelian woods. And indeed, there's a bedroom which is entirely lined with Karelian woods, as if it's some sort of peasant log cabin. Many noblemen, like Natasha's uncle, it would seem, renounced the service culture of St. Petersburg altogether and tried to live a simpler, or, as they saw it, more Russian way of life with the peasantry on their estates. And there were even noblemen who lived with peasant wives, as Natasha's uncle did. One of them, the richest man in Russia at the time, with perhaps 1 million serfs, namely Count Nikolai Petrovich Sheremetyev. He shocked society in 1801 by marrying this woman here, Praskovia Zemchugova, who had been, until just before the marriage, a serf singer in Sheremetyev's private opera. Tolstoy himself, we know, fell in love with a serf on his estate. And his feelings for Aksenia Bazykina, which he described to Turgenev, another man, by the way, who had fathered children by serf women, were not those, as Turgenev's might have been, the feelings of a stag, but, as Tolstoy put it to Turgenev, the feelings of a husband for a wife. And there are now documents suggesting that he even continued to see Bazykina after he'd married Sofia Bears in the early 1860s. And there's that interesting story, The Devil, written in, I think, 1889, where the narrator imagines what it might have been like if, instead of marrying a noblewoman, he had actually married the peasant woman that he loved, and who appears cleaning the floors and before his wife, and there's that moment of recognition between wife and former lover. Okay, the interaction between these two cultural worlds, which were so distinct in so many ways, the educated Europeanized culture of the upper classes and the village culture of the peasantry. This interaction had a crucial influence on the national consciousness and on all the major forms of art in the 19th century. And as I say, that interaction is a major theme of Natasha's dance. But the story which I tell is not meant to suggest that a single national culture emerged as a result. Russia was obviously too complex, too big, too ill-defined geographically, much too divided socially and politically for a single national culture to be passed off as the sort of national heritage. And, moreover, I would say there was no authentic village culture of the sort imagined by Tolstoy in the dancing scene. I mean, if you think about the elements in it. The melody to which Natasha dances, it's not a folk tune as far as we can tell. Came a Maiden Down the Street might have begun as a folk tune, but it actually came down to the village as a popular melody in sheet music. So like so many folk tunes, they were popularised having gone through the towns and coming back into the countryside. Indeed, are there any really genuine folk tunes? I mean, there are probably only about 4 or 5 folk tunes in the whole of Europe, and they just get circulated around the place and coming in and out of urban societies and changed and back into the countryside. Other elements of the village culture Tolstoy pictured may have come to Russia, one might think, from the Asiatic steppe, courtesy of the Mongol horsemen who ruled indirectly over Russia from the 13th to the 15th century, and then who stayed in Russia for the most part as agriculturalists, pastoralists, traders, and indeed, as I'm sure you know, many of them entering into the aristocracy itself. Natasha's shawl was almost certainly of Persian origin, although from the 1820s there were a number of peasant factories in the Russian provinces producing, peasant-type shawls, but often copying Oriental patterns to cater to the tastes of society ladies in the towns who couldn't afford or who couldn't get quick access to a Persian shawl. The balalaika that Uncle plays was descended, musical ethnographers tell us, from the dobra, a guitar of Central Asian origin, and a guitar which also spawned as one of its legacies the gusli, which you see here, a sort of hurdy-gurdy used in much folk music throughout Russia, and tuned usually to 5 strings, because, so some musical ethnographers of the late 19th century argued, 5-string because it basically, much of Russian folk music was similar to or aligned to the pentatonic or 5-tone Indo-Chinese scale. So you see, in fact, from even as early as the 1860s, composers like Balakirev and, for a while, Rimsky-Korsakov, trying to sort of orientalize the Russian music style by writing elements of it in the pentatonic scale. I think the first example of it is about 1868 with the Tamara suite, the piano suite by Balakirev. Natasha's dance itself, for all we know, may have come from Asia. I mean, if you think about the Russian tradition of dancing in lines and circles rather than in pairs, it doesn't have much in common with the waltz Natasha would have danced at the ball. And moreover, the movements don't come from the body as a whole, they come from the shoulders, from the hands, the subtle doll-like movements of the head. Now, during the late 19th century, there was a growing interest in this possible Asiatic influence on Russian folk culture. And it began around about the 1870s with the great nationalist critic Vladimir Stasov, who made a study both of Russian ornament and of the Russian folk epics, epic tales, the Byliny. And he said that both of them, or I tried to argue that both of them were in fact just Russified forms of Oriental patterns. And this, so he would argue, for example, the great tales like Sadko and Ilya Muromets, which for the Slavophiles were, of course, the classic example of Russia's homegrown culture, had in fact come to Russia courtesy of traders and warriors and the rest, and been Russified with elements from Russian life added to them. And he based this notion on a theory of culture, which I think to a large extent I would subscribe to myself, which is that actually cultures don't just grow from the soil, so to speak. They are borrowed. And this was Theodore Benthey's theory of cultural borrowing, that actually most cultures work by interchange, and that all cultures are actually much more international than people who advocate their preservation or put them at the centre of their nationalist politics would advocate. Well, as I've suggested then, the Slavophiles and the mythological school, who were closely aligned with the Slavophiles, took great offence at Stasov's theories, and we can return to that at question time, perhaps. But Stasov's theories had enormous influence on a number of Russian artists at the turn of the century, none more so than Nikolai Roerich, the painter, who, as you probably know, was also an archaeologist involved in the excavation of Scythian burial mounds in the Crimea, whose treasures can now be found in the Winter Palace itself. And Stasov, I beg your pardon, Roerich had this idea of, sort of Scythian Rus as being something that he could concoct, really, out of elements that he would have borrowed from Eastern patterns themselves. Along with Roerich, Stravinsky took to these theories of the Eurasian element in Russian culture, and indeed in the 1920s became a fully fledged member of the Eurasianist circle. And here we can see him in 1909, Stravinsky on the left there, transcribing a folk song being played, sung by a gusli player on the steps of his estate at Ust-Ilug, which is now, I believe, in Lithuania, with his mother holding his son there, Theodore, in her arms. And Stravinsky was obviously very interested in trying to capture the elements of Russian folk song, which he increasingly came to see as actually quite distinct from the European folk song tradition, particularly in terms of its rhythms, with his discovery, courtesy of musical ethnographers in the 1890s, that the sung accentuation of Russian language was much freer and could be quite different from the spoken accentuation of Russian poetry or language. And this clearly gave Stravinsky the endless possibility to introduce greater rhythmic freedom to his music. And along with Roerich, he came to this conception, I think, of the Rite of Spring in a sort of Scythian mould. Here we're going to show some of the distinct non-European elements of Russian culture at play. So we can see it, for example, here is Roerich's painting, The Idols from 1901, which shows you this sort of fantasy of Neolithic Russia, with elements from those sort of totems that Roerich would have borrowed quite directly from Stasov's own ethnographic work. He wrote to Stasov at this period, asking him for advice about what sort of motifs would have been used in Neolithic Russia. And Stasov wrote back to him and said, well, just copy it from what you can find in Tatar motifs or Persian motifs today, because, quote, where is my quote? It says, Stasov said, basically, ancient Russia and the ancient East are the same thing. We can see it, too, in the choreography. Here's Roerich's costumes for the Rite of Spring. It's not particularly clear here, but Roerich did introduce copies of Tatar jewellery to the headdress, and, the heavy necklaces and things like that, which are directly copied by Roerich from Tatar collections. And we can see it in the choreography there you see their feet turned in and their elbows sticking out, in contravention of all the basic rules of classical ballet, which are supposed to emphasize lightness and movement. Here, the choreography of Fokine in The Rite of Spring is clearly emphasizing the immobility of the dancers, their heaviness, or неподвижность, as the musical term for that immobility goes, and an immobility which clearly lies at the heart of the explosive energy of the music in The Rite of Spring. Okay, why this excursion into this Asiatic corner? Because essentially what I've tried to put to you is that there is no authentic culture at the heart of the village scene pictured by Tolstoy in War and Peace. That in fact, as in most cultures, I would argue, so much of Russian culture was in fact imported and borrowed from abroad and then adapted in various ways. But if that's the case, that there's no authentic ethnographic culture, if it is the case that much of any culture is in fact invented, then all we have are mythic images of culture, just like Natasha's version of the peasant dance. That's not to say that Russian culture is just an intellectual construction, in those sort of jargonistic terms so fashionable to cultural historians these days. Russia was more than a discourse. There was a real Russia that was real enough. There was a historic Russia. There was a landscape, a physical Russia. And there was, I would say, a set of customs and beliefs, a temperament, which is undeniable. And it means that Stravinsky, after 50 years of living in the West, could return, as we see him here, landing at Sheremetyevo Airport, could return to his homeland after 50 years and pick up instinctively, just as Natasha had picked up the dance instinctively, could pick up instinctively modes of speech, social interaction. He could slip into childish expressions that he had not employed for over 50 years. So, if it's not my aim to deny this Russia, that there is a real temperament out there, how do we get at it? And what do we make of the myths that build on these fictive images of what Russian culture is? To answer the second point first, I would say that we need to look at the way artistic myths become powerful political forces. And they do so in an extraordinary way in Russia. If you think about it, all the great cultural forces, movements of Russia in the 19th century were organized around these fictive myths, fictive images of Russia. The Slavophiles with their myth of the Russian soul. The Westerners with their cult of Petersburg. The populists with their notions of the peasant as a natural socialist. Or the Scythians with their view of Russia as an elemental culture from the Asiatic steppe. Now, the point about these myths is they're not just constructions of national identity. They played a crucial role in shaping the allegiances of Russia's politics, as well as in developing notions of the self, from the most elevated forms of personal and national identity to the most quotidian matters of dress, speech, interior design, and so on. I mean, the examples are a classic. The Slavophiles are a classic case in point. Their notion of, homegrown Russian Christian principles organized a new political community in the 19th century, made up largely of the provincial gentry, Moscow intellectuals, many priests, and indeed many liberal sections of the bureaucracy. And their politics helped to shape everything from policies about free trade to foreign policy to gentry attitudes towards the peasant. And as a cultural movement, they affected the way people dressed, the way they spoke, the way they designed their interiors and so on. It was all, bar shoes and onion domes, which itself became, I would say, one of the most unhelpful myths about Russian culture. The one exported by the Ballet Russe, exotic Russia, with its own mythic image of Natasha's dance. One of the things I would stress is just this immense complexity of Russian culture, and indeed its centrality to European civilization. Because if you think about all the great cultural figures of the 19th century, the Pushkins and the Tolstoys and the Stravinskys, they are inextricably both Europeans and Russians. And that sensibility has to be understood as something complex, which leads me to my second point, how we get at that sensibility. And the way I've tried to do it in the book is to look at it in terms of custom and convention as reflected in as many different art forms as one can, both in terms of furniture, clothing, but also in terms of the way they are articulated in fiction and in art. Because eventually, we have to recognize, I think, that, we use this word national identity. We use it, it seems to me, almost synonymously with the rather old-fashioned and now politically incorrect term, national character. But what is this? It's not something we can just derive from works of art and style. And it's not something we can make up simply as literary discourse either. If national identity is to mean anything, it must mean behaviour. And so what we can actually use prescriptive literature for, what we can use works of literature and art for, genre painting, what we can use diaries and letters for, and above all memoirs, the tremendously rich tradition of memoir writing in Russia in the 19th century. What we can use all of this stuff for is to try and get at codes of behaviour, the rituals and signs of the significance of social interaction, by which these works of art are the public meaning of these works of art is fixed, and by which the inner life of a society is organised. Because, as I'm sure you're all aware, I'm going to finish in just a minute, if that's okay. There are distinct modes of behaviour for every European Russian. There are moments when they have to act out, or as Peter commanded them to, they have to almost act out their European manners like an actor on the stage. And then there are other moments, perhaps more informal moments, more relaxed moments, when perhaps even unconsciously they can become more themselves in a Russian milieu. Natasha's visit to her uncle was one such switch, it seems to me, or the picturing of one such switch. The way she was expected to behave at home in the Rostov Palace or at the ball where she was presented to the emperor was a world apart from this village scene where her expressive nature was allowed free rein. And it was evidently her gregarious enjoyment of such a relaxed social setting that communicated itself in her dance. This same sense of relaxation, of becoming more oneself in a Russian milieu, was shared by many Russians of Natasha's class and generation, including her own uncle, it would seem. The simple recreations of the country house or dacha, going into the woods, visiting the bathhouse, or what Nabokov called the very Russian sport of khadyt po gribi, hunting for mushrooms, were more than the retrieval of a rural idyll. They were the expressions of one's Russianness. So identity is a fashionable term, but it's meaningless unless we can show how it manifests itself in behaviour. And what I've tried to do then is to interweave through works of art that might express that behaviour, the sort of diaries and letters, the sort of memoir literature that would give us something about the way the Russians saw, of a particular class, so the literary class, of course, saw such things as childhood, the way to methods of child rearing, or marriage, or the way they responded to death, or their response to the landscape, and so on. And I've done this because it seems to me that these episodes are the place where we could find, perhaps in life, the unseen threads of a common Russian sensibility, such as Tolstoy had imagined in his celebrated dancing scene. Thank you.
Okay, we'd like to take some questions from the audience at this point. I want to go ahead and start. One of the themes that you drew out was the issue of language, and I was wondering if you see that as being particularly relevant today with the encroachment of the English language in Russian culture.
Yes, it is a parallel, isn't it? Certainly, in terms of the penetration, it is comparable, but even probably more so, I would have thought, the penetration of the English language in Russia today. But in the sort of Russia of Tolstoy's childhood, it was rather more subtle and complex than that, because clearly, okay, there are lots of distinctions to be made. I mean, in the provinces, probably Russian was more common, but in the sort of cosmopolitan society which he was describing in War and Peace, it created tremendous polarities and confusion, because basically, there was a sphere of being expected to speak quite intimate thoughts in a foreign tongue from quite an early age. You might recall that scene in Anna Karenina when I think it's one of the little Shcherbatsky children comes in while Levin is there and is asking for, I think, a balloon or something childish, and the mother chides the child and says, "You must ask for this in French," which seems so artificial. And I think which is something that might explain why there was such nostalgia for those serf nannies, why the nanny becomes such a sort of cult figure in Russia, because it was, you know, not just a feminine sphere, but it was actually the sphere where they were introduced to Russian language and folklore, and they didn't have to try and express themselves in a foreign tongue. But so there are complex emotional divisions, there are complex intellectual traditions. There are all sorts of rules about when you can speak in French and when you can speak in Russian. And I spent quite a lot of time trying to look into how it was used. There are two sort of dynasties that run through the book, the Sheremetyev and the Volkonskys. And I spent a lot of time looking at the letters of the Volkonsky princes. And they slip in and out of Russian into French within one sentence. And often, the fascinating thing is that often they go into Russian from French. I detected some sort of pattern in Sergei Volkonsky, the Decembrist, in any case, which might be indicative because he's a Decembrist. But he switched from French into Russian when he wanted to insist on his sincerity or something like that, when he wanted to be honest, which sort of reminds me of. It reminds me of that scene in War and Peace when I think it's Princess Helene. Yes, is having to face up to the fact that she's going to have to talk about her infidelities to Bezukhov, and she says, "How am I going to put this meaning? Obviously, what language am I going to speak?" And then she decides, "Well, it's so much easier to lie in French."
Yes, right down here, and microphone will come to you.
Thank you. I was just wondering, as you were giving your talk, the Russian word "buit" came to mind.
Buit, yeah.
And is this what you're after?
Yeah, you're right. It is. If I could have called it, yeah. I mean, it's an attempt to write a book called Kultura I Buit, isn't it? But you can't. How do you put buit into English? You don't. But there is that extraordinary Russian concept of buit, and an extraordinary consciousness that it's not just custom, is it? It's not just sort of everyday life, it is integral to what writers do. I'm always reminded of there's a wonderful line in Shostakovich's Lady Macbeth, when one of the characters says about Gogol, he was so good at describing Russian buit. And so it's this sense that life is in the art. And that descriptive element of trying to grasp the essence of what it is all about is in the kultura. But yes, you're absolutely right. It is kultura and buit.
Yes, right here on the side.
I'd like to suggest that perhaps the khalat that Pushkin is wearing is not from the peasant, but is the same one that the French and the Americans at about the same time used to define an intellectual, that you had yourself pictured.
It's Bohemian.
An American art historian from the Portrait Gallery has written on it about 2 years ago.
Oh, really? I love the reference.
It's a very interesting thing that you don't wear your own clothes, that you wear essentially a sort of academic robe, a Greek throwback.
Yes. So it's that sort of Grecian thing, is it, do you think? Yes, like Byron.
And it has another word, too, another title for it, halat something or other else.
Right, okay.
It was an artistic convention.
Oh, well, then the example, thank you so much for putting that. Can I chase you for a reference afterwards? But yes, that's useful. But so the example's a bad one, perhaps. But that thing of, you read quite often about how when they would go to the dacha, for example, they would wear more relaxed clothing, and the whole thing of a dressing gown, the Oblomov, like Oriental dressing gown. So, yeah, the Muscovite thing. And it's also the interesting thing here, too, I think, is that there's very little distinction, often, although I don't think it's consciously a lack of distinction, between what is relaxed Russian and what is relaxed Oriental. Is Oblomov being Russian or Asiatic when he's in his dressing gown? When they talk about the Scythian temperament, when Herzen says, "I'm a true Scyth," and which is my right to be savage and uncivilized and uncultivated, that is the same. You could apply that to the Asiatic temperament in the Russian way that is cast, just as much as one could apply, in fact, to the Russian temperament as it might be cast in counter-distinction to the European behaviour as expected. But thank you for that reference. It's very interesting.
Okay, can I ask if you have a question to raise your hand and leave it up for a second while I get everybody's bearings? Okay, we have 4 questions left in about 15 minutes. Why don't we go here to Alexander Etkin?
I'm Boris Lanin, scholar canon. Canon scholar, sorry. What's the essence of your book, Kultura и быт, culture and быт, or Kultura, culture against быт? Why Russians struggle against быт and more often against culture, the whole history?
So you're referring to a sort of distinction between быт and бытие, or the transcendence of быт as being...
Быт and culture.
Yeah.
Do they live in harmony?
Oh, I see.
Struggle one against each other?
Well, but yes, both. I mean, I think they have a complex relationship, as you suggest, don't they? Because there's this element of actually so much of what goes into Russian art forms of one sort or another is a reflection of быт, and is a sort of digestion of bıt, a reflection on bıt. And at the same time, there's this striving to transcend bıt, to something more meaningful, which Svetlana Boym has made a lot of, I think quite persuasively actually, the notion that there's an attempt to transcend the poshlust of bıt, as Gogol might put it, and to achieve some sort of higher moral truth. And there is that element, and one might be almost tempted to link it not just to sort of mysticism generally, or transcendentalism, or religious ideas generally, but also to the sense that you get in so much Russian literature, don't you, of basically the Russia of the provinces being some sort of hellhole, really. It's some sort of place which is you've got to get out of it, because it's just a what Mussorgsky called it, the all-Russian bog. And there is that sort of sense of needing to transcend.
Okay, our next question is on the side here.
It's actually a short comment. I'm sorry for microcriticism, but I have another halat to mention.
Okay.
You showed us the image of gusli player.
Yeah.
But as I could see, and if I'm correct, he was playing not gusli, but modification of kobza, which is an instrument, a string instrument played with the help of revolving hand.
So it's a sort of mechanized.
Yeah, I am not a musical historian, but I believe that it's better to consult this image with a musical historian, because, you know, the devil is in details.
Sure, no, I will. On the back of the photograph, which came from the Russian Museum of Ethnography, it was gusli player. But I shall go back to them and say, my friend says it's not. But you're quite, it may be, obviously, in the late 19th century, there were more and more mechanized forms, as you're suggesting, coming in.
Mechanized form coming from Ukraine, but becoming common for the southern region of Russia.
Right.
Just better to check.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, right here, gentleman in the jacket.
Could you comment on the role of religion in the organized church in the evolving configuration of the national identity?
Sure, with pleasure, yeah. Well, I see it as central, obviously. I would, though, say I'm particularly interested in... it's often said, isn't it, that the church is the one unifying force, and I suppose in many ways it is the one unifying force. Rather than the state in many ways. But I'm also impressed by the fact that actually, especially in the late 19th century, the church looks very fragile in other ways too, because of the huge growing spread of the sects. I mean, recent work now suggesting that the sectarians were many more than we had thought before. And researching into the whole thing about the church and Tolstoy and the conflicts over excommunication, I see a church actually which is quite defensive about its and wary about its ability to actually play that national unifying force. So I would say that the church as a sort of as an established church, so we say, is perhaps not as it's obviously important, but it's certainly not as spiritually alive as the broader search for religious truth, for more informal types of orthodoxy, which as in Dostoevsky's Karamazov, the Alexa who goes beyond the monastery walls. I think those religious searchings, which are tremendously influential, not just on writers and all the rest, but very influential socially, in terms of all those God seekers and in terms of all those people who went off in search of kingdoms of Epona and all the rest of it. All of that religious seeking is a very powerful social force and a very powerful element in the national consciousness. But I would spread it much wider than just the walls of the church, I think.
Okay, we have a few requests left. We'll go to the gentleman back, and then we'll move up to the front a little bit.
You mentioned the introduction of the study of grammar. I assume you meant for the children of the upper class. But did the peasants at that time get all the endings and the cases right? It's such a plague for us to worry about that. Were the peasants speaking the true Russian with all the grammar lined up properly?
That's really hard to say, because the philologists who took an interest in whatever form of plain speech they could write down, as far as I know, didn't take an interest in the grammar being used by peasants of different localities. They were just trying to record, like Kirevsky and others, they were just trying to record the actual content of tales and things like that. So it would be rather difficult to tell. Later on, people like Nekrasov become interested in those elements and introduce I mean, it's seen as anathema by people like Turgenev trying to introduce the plain speech into poetry. But Nekrasov does quite a lot of work on the sort of grammar used in dialect, is I suppose how he would see it. But maybe someone in the room knows more about this. But as far as I'm aware, we can't actually tell much about differences in grammatical and syntax rules from region to region. But to come back to your question on grammar, yes, it was something that you don't see very often. You don't see very often in the late 18th century set Russian grammar and, more importantly, perhaps set rhetoric as a discipline to be introduced to the curriculum of a well-educated Petersburg nobleman destined for the civil service. And I think that is a very important sort of cultural shift around that time, that Russian is obviously something that that aristocratic people think is going to be important for service culture.
Okay, we have time for two more questions.
Perhaps he wants to come back on it. I don't know.
Do you want to come back?
Did you want to come back on it?
Related, would you take the best stab at it you can, translating Brit into English or French or German or something?
Brit, way of life, I suppose. Brit, yeah.
Okay. Bob Cruz, next question.
Thank you. My question is really about the methodology of writing about national culture in an empire. So following on Boris's question, what is the relationship here between Russkaya kultura and Rossiyskaya? And for example, you've written a long, wonderful book, but to push you further on the length and scope of the project, is Ukraine part of the story?
God, yes. Well, obviously I had to make a decision fairly early on whether I was going to be talking about Russkaya kultura or Rossiyski things, and I decided that actually what interested me was Russkaya, and for reasons I can explain in relation to the Soviet period too, because I wanted to see what was really at the heart of holding a people together rather than what were official forms of culture. Although obviously that's not to deny that the imperial identity has been a very powerful one, particularly within Petrine civilization. That's undeniable. On the question of the Ukraine, that means that, or indeed any other area, that means that I've had to make sacrifices. I mean, it's not a comprehensive history. I mean, how could one do that? I mean, it's
pretty comprehensive.
It's pretty fat. We managed to get thinner than that to deceive readers in the British edition. But yeah, it's obviously a selective history. You know, I mean, there's people I don't like or don't get in there. But as far as it means in terms of the national question, it means inevitably that I have spoken a little bit about the Russian fascination with Ukrainian culture as a sort of, southern thing. So, the reason why Gogol's early tales were so popular, but I haven't actually looked at Ukrainian culture and how it saw Russian culture, or how since, indeed, 91, it's tried to extricate itself from Russian culture, which I think is a very interesting question. So it means that, the Caucasus are there, but only insofar as they are, part of a Russian myth of the Caucasus. So that's what I've done.
Orlando Ffaigs is author of Natasha's Dance. It's published by Metropolitan Books, a division of Henry Holt and Company. Visit henryholt.com for more information. Over the past 300 years by author Orlando Ffaigs. Beginning with the building of St. Petersburg, Ffaigs interweaves great works with cultural and artistic events through the challenges of the Soviet and post-Soviet regimes. The program runs about an hour.
Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of Kennan Institute Director Blair Rubel, I welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Joseph Dresden, and I am a program associate with the Kennan Institute. Before we begin, I'd like to announce some upcoming events for next week. On Monday, November 4th, Vladimir Dubovik, a visiting scholar at the University of Maryland, College Park, and a former Kennan Institute Regional Exchange Scholar, will give a presentation on U.S.-Ukraine relations in the new security environment. Later that week, on November 7th, it's a Thursday, James Duran, Professor Emeritus, Department of History of Canisius College, will speak on Putin's economic straitjacket, austere budgeting in a poor state. Today we are privileged to host a book launch for Natasha's Dance, A Cultural History of Russia, written by Orlando Ffaigs, Professor of History at Birkbeck College of London University. Here is a copy of the book, and there are copies for sale outside. Professor Ffaigs has agreed to sign books purchased here after this session. Professor Ffaigs is one of the foremost authorities on Russian history, and his book on the Russian Revolution, A People's Tragedy, is the recipient of the Wolfson Prize for History and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, among others. His newest book, Natasha's Dance, has been met with early widespread acclaim from the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books, Publishers Weekly, Kirkus Reviews, only to name a few. It is a sweeping panorama of Russian culture and history from the founding of St. Petersburg, Russia's window to the West, to the Brezhnev era and composer Igor Stravinsky's.
But he lives there, retired army captain from civil service, with a woman called Anicia, who's introduced as his housekeeper, but it becomes clear from the looks between them that she's also some sort of unofficial wife. And she brings in a tray laden with lots of Russian goodies, cherry brandy, vodka of various flavors, and then Natasha hears the strains of a balalaika being played from a back room where the hunting serfs are, and Uncle realizes she's curious and calls for his guitar to be brought out, and he begins to play a popular melody, Came a Maiden Down the Street, and calls on Natasha to dance. And let me just read briefly from that scene. "Now then, niece," he exclaimed, waving to Natasha the hand that had just struck a chord. Natasha threw off the shawl from her shoulders, ran forward to face Uncle, and setting her arms akimbo, also made a motion with her shoulders and struck an attitude. "Where?" How and when had this young countess, educated by an émigré French governess, imbibed from the Russian air she breathed that spirit and obtained that manner which the pas de châle would, one would have supposed, long ago have effaced? But the spirit and the movements were those inimitable and unteachable Russian ones that Uncle had expected of her. As soon as she had struck her pose and smiled triumphantly, proudly, and with sly merriment, she had the fear that had first seized Nikolai and the others that she might not do the right thing was at an end, and they were all already admiring her. She did the right thing with such precision, such complete precision, that Anisia Fyodorovna, who had at once handed her the handkerchief she needed for the dance, had tears in her eyes, though she laughed as she watched this slim, graceful countess.
Emotional return to his homeland from 50 years of exile. It is also a search to understand Russianness through pulling on strings of history, poetry, folklore, customs and rituals, landscape, music, and of course a certain famous dance from Russian literature. We are pleased to have Professor ʻfaɪdʒiːz with us here today, and we look forward to hearing his thoughts on his ambitious new work.
Joseph, thank you very much. I take it I'm audible. Can you see that picture at the back? No.
We could. We're dimming the lights right now.
Dim the lights. Ah, that's great. Thank you very much. Yes. Well, thank you for that, Joseph. It's a pleasure to be here. And as you say, the book is made up of a lot of different components, trying to get at something quite subtle and elusive indeed, namely a sensibility which one could place at the heart of something we would call culture, whatever that is, and I would like to try and unpack both those concepts a bit today. Having finished the book and not really knowing how to frame it, my editor in America said, well, why don't you focus on something rather beautiful? And since the book had always really been about trying to engage with the beauty that I've always found in Russia, I decided to go to the Natasha dancing scene because it was always a scene I'd loved, and Natasha was always someone I'd been in love with. And in fact, as I began to think about it more and more, it was a very useful way to introduce some of the themes of the book and also some of the questions about how one can write a cultural history at all. No doubt the scene is known to all of you here, I'm sure, but let me just recap very briefly on it. It's that moment in War and Peace when Natasha Rostov and her brother Nikolai find themselves at the end of a day's hunting in the woods being invited back to their uncle's cabin. It's not really clear whether he is an uncle of the Rostov family. Uncle appears in inverted commas. Reared in silks and velvets and so different from herself, who yet was able to understand all that was in Anisia and in Anisia's father and mother and aunt and in every Russian man and woman. So we could ask what enabled Natasha to pick up so instinctively the rhythms of the dance. How could she step so easily into this village culture from which, by education and social class, she was so obviously far removed? Are we to suppose, as Tolstoy does in this romantic and, one might add, highly unlikely scene, that a nation such as Russia may be held together by the unseen threads of a native sensibility? This, then, is the question that I've tried to tackle. And the subject of the book is not just, as a cultural history, great creative works of art, like War and Peace, but cultural artifacts, from the folk embroidery of Natasha's shawl to the musical conventions of the peasant dance. And it's folklore and religion and social customs and beliefs as well. What I wanted to do was to explore the way that music, art and literature, all the great art forms, became entangled with custom and social belief in the apprehension and artistic articulation of what we call national identity. I wanted to explain, moreover, how these artistic myths of Russia became powerful political ideas that organized society. Russian culture, it seems to me, needs historians to make these broad, multidisciplinary links. If you think about it, nowhere else have the arts been quite so entangled in social movements and ideas. Because basically, for the past 200 years or so, the arts in Russia have served as a main arena for political, philosophical, and religious debate in the absence of a parliament or a free press or even a free church. As Tolstoy explained in A Few Words About War and Peace, the great artistic prose works of the 19th century were not meant as novels in the European sense. They were huge poetic structures for symbolic contemplation, not unlike an icon, laboratories in which to test ideas, and like science or religion, they were animated by the search for truth. But the overarching theme of all these works, or the great majority of them, it seems to me, was the theme of Russia itself, its history and destiny, its spiritual essence, its place in the world, in a way that was extraordinary, if not unique to Russia. The country's artistic energy was almost wholly given to the quest to grasp the idea of its nationality. Nowhere has the artist been quite so burdened with the task of national leadership, and for that very reason, nowhere has the artist been more feared and persecuted by the state. Alienated from official Russia by their politics, from peasant Russia by their education, Russia's artists from roughly the 1820s and 30s onwards took it on themselves to create a national community through values and ideas of literature and art. And at the center of many of their works is the question of what it means to be a Russian. Where was the true Russia? In Europe or in Asia? In Petersburg or in Moscow? In the palaces of the Tsars or in the muddy one-street village where Natasha's uncle lived? These, then, were the questions that preoccupied not just every serious writer, poet, musician, artist, but many folklorists and indeed many geologists and archaeologists in that golden age of Russian culture, from the age of Pushkin to the age of Pasternak. And what I've tried to do is to take